For those not accustomed to it, life in rural Eastern Europe can feel very lonely and isolating. I've spent all of my teenage life and most of my childhood in London, but recently, about a year ago, we were forced to move back to the old country due to financial reasons. I couldn't have been older than 3 or 4 when we first transitioned to the UK, so my memories of my hometown were foggy at best. An old apartment complex in the middle of an industrial district isn't exactly the most scenic place to grow up either, but though definitely drab at times, it always felt alive. There was always something to do, and more interesting parts of town were just a short bus ride away. Here, there are only grasslands stretching for miles in whichever direction I look, not to mention the 4-hour drive between me and the nearest city. And for the record, I don't have a license. Most of my days out here are spent helping my dad trying to find a decent internet connection, which is close to impossible. You have no idea how many attempts it took to post this. I've never been much of an extrovert, but having nobody to talk or relate to, it does take a toll on you. The local population is primarily comprised of people past their 60s. The last family with a kid closer to my age had apparently moved nearly a decade ago, which you can definitely see why. Unfortunately, as you probably already guessed, boredom hasn't been the worst thing that I've had to contend with, not even close. I remember when I first saw her. It was still technically summer at the time, so evenings were tolerable, if not exactly warm. Dad and I were taking a walk along the dirt road that connects the village to the nearest highway. He was talking about how I just needed to hold out for a few more years, and that we would be able to move again once we had saved enough money. The prospect of spending literal years trapped in some desolate hamlet in the middle of nowhere isn't exactly assuring. But with him getting older and Mom's disabilities, I can't abandon them either. They are by no means perfect parents, but they've always tried their best and I appreciate them for it. I remember looking over at my father only to notice something in the distance past his shoulder. I strained my eyes. The gloom was far too dense to fully penetrate, but I could definitely distinguish the outline of someone standing amidst the tall grass, towering above it. The figure was that of a woman. A very tall and lanky woman. Her proportions were impossible, but they were intimidating, especially coupled with the slanted stance and the fact that she stood just there, swaying like a willow in a windstorm. Dad glanced over his shoulder as well, but then just looked back at me confused. "What is it?" he asked. I was so taken aback by the question that I didn't know how to respond. How did he miss the giant woman standing in the middle of the field directly behind him? I watched as the imposing silhouette suddenly began to descend, almost as if being swallowed by the earth itself, before disappearing beneath the grass entirely. Once I had finally managed to articulate what I had seen, Dad had cut our walk short and we jogged home. There is nobody that lives here that even comes close to matching that description, but it certainly wasn't beyond the realm of possibility that some creepy tall woman was wandering these steps at night. Weirdos aren't exclusive to the big city, you know. I felt nervous whenever I had to go out for the next few days, but the odd encounter eventually slipped my mind. Neither of us ever told Mom since we didn't want her to blow the whole thing out of proportion. And besides, she rarely left the house anyway. I had all but forgotten about the woman and the step. That is, until about a week or so later. We were called over by an old couple that lives at the edge of town, conveniently right by that same road. Now the request wasn't anything out of the ordinary. One of their goats had croaked during the night. Since both of them were in their 80s and they needed our help to drag it out of the pen, we did as they asked, and we were rewarded for our efforts with coffee and toast. It was then that the wife said something to me that I'll never forget. I'll do my best to translate it. This old coot doesn't believe me, but I swear on our grandchildren's lives that I saw something walking down the old path before I went to bed last night. At first I thought it could have been you, but the girl was much, much taller. The tallest woman that I've ever seen. The way she walked was odd too, like she was hurt, limping her way down to town. Dad and I looked at each other from across the table. He chimed in on my behalf. What do you think it could have been? In hindsight, I'm thankful that he stopped me from confessing that I had seen the woman too. We would have likely been accused of leading her back to the settlement. As I was soon about to find out, folk around these parts love having someone else to blame for their misfortunes. I don't know, she's not from around here, and that's for sure. If you ask me, she's probably the reason our animals keep dying. Outsiders have always been a bad omen. Be quiet, you hag. The man and his daughter aren't here to listen to your crazy stories. The husband finally had a chance to intervene, which, after some more back and forth, devolved into a typical domestic dispute. We thanked the elderly couple for their hospitality and promptly excused ourselves, though I doubt either of them noticed. Over the next several weeks, more and more animals kept turning up dead. The closest thing that we have to a vet couldn't determine a cause. Goats, sheep, pigs, cattle, even dogs. Animals that looked completely healthy one day were gone the next. One day, my parents woke up to find a coop filled with dead chickens. There was nothing wrong with them as far as any of us could tell. They just lie there motionless while the ones still alive pecked carelessly around them. There was talk of a plague, but the idea was quickly brushed aside. What sort of plague kills overnight with no preceding symptoms? It was almost as if they were being poisoned, which briefly became the leading theory. That was until the start of October, when a shepherd found something in the small birch grove that borders the town. Concealed between the trees was this crude arrangement of rocks. They were obviously placed there on purpose, and overlooking them was this cross between a scarecrow and a humanly sized effigy made of twigs. It was a rusted cowbell dangling from its neck and a ram's skull for a head. There was something about the way that it just stood there, arms raised, praising something that none of us could see. It made me feel vulnerable, tiny, like there was this benevolent force perpetually looming above us. Witchcraft, somebody yelled. We've been cursed, spurted another. We scattered the rocks and burned the idol the same day. As I watched it get swallowed by the flames, I couldn't help but feel that this was what the one who placed it there intended. I still think that this is the exact moment we unknowingly doomed ourselves, and that everything that follows could have been prevented. It's too late now, though. Things only got worse as time went on. More animals kept dropping dead for no discernible reason, and the bodies were piling up. And we couldn't even use the meat, as we still feared that it might have somehow been tainted. So we ended up just burying them outside of town. It was when the crops, our main source of income and food, started withering that things truly got desperate. Everyone became convinced that there was a witch among us. With my family being the most recent addition to the community, we were obviously the first to fall under scrutiny. Thankfully, my dad had managed to appease the growing mob by pointing out that this supposed curse had severely impacted our livelihood as well. It made no sense that we would be the ones responsible. And so, accusations started getting levied against the next most plausible candidate. I won't be using her real name out of respect for the poor woman, so I'll just refer to her as Maria. Maria was about the same age as my mother, maybe slightly older, only she had never married nor had any kids of her own. I never really got a clear answer as to why, and I'm not about to start speculating. All you need to know is that she had been living in relative solitude for years, which made her a prime suspect in the eyes of the traditionalist populace. Adding to it was the fact that her livestock had overall been spared, though she wasn't even the sole outlier in that regard. There is no doubt in my mind that her targeting was largely the result of a pre-existing prejudice, and things were about to get a whole lot worse for her. Every day, I would walk by her house and see a fresh batch of crosses carved into her door. People called her all kinds of names whenever they saw her in public. One time, I even witnessed several women throw rocks at her, which the men eagerly encouraged. You might be wondering why these saner among us didn't do anything to help. The unfortunate truth is that times were already tough and nobody wanted to risk getting themselves or their loved ones implicated by proxy. Also, good luck getting any outside authorities to intervene. Nothing short of a murder would ever convince an officer to come all the way out here. And it just so happens that's exactly what it took. Time had been somewhat of a blur since the day I found her. I remember that it had snowed the previous night. Everything was covered in this crisp sheet of white. I was probably on my way to the only general store that there is here. It was far too cold for a casual stroll. Suddenly, I heard the distinct intermittent jingling of what sounded like a cowbell coming from somewhere nearby. As I circled past Maria's homestead like I've always done, I saw her, displayed at the foot of her own doorstep like some perverse art exhibit. Her partially stripped body was tied to a fence post, swollen and bruised beyond recognition. Frost clung to her dark hair as it flapped in the freezing wind, obscuring disfigured features that hardly resembled a face anymore. And there it was. The same cowbell that we had found around the idol's neck now hung from hers, attached to a hoop of rope and barbed wire, knocking about by the wind. I was so thoroughly desensitized by that point that I just turned around and went home. I didn't even tell my parents. Somebody did eventually call the police, but nothing really came out of it. There was an investigation, suspects were questioned, but it ultimately got swept under the rug. Maria didn't have any relatives or friends that were willing to pursue the matter further, so it was just sort of forgotten about by the time Christmas had rolled around. And people do have their suspicions about who could have done it, of course. It is generally assumed to have been the shepherd, with the help of a few of his drinking buddies, since he's always been Maria's most outspoken detractor, even before any of this cursed stuff had happened. The thing is, I don't think he did it. There's a detail that I've been deliberately neglecting to mention. I wanted to get the verifiable facts out of the way first. Throughout most of the events that I've described, the aforementioned tall woman has been haunting nearly every waking moment of my life. Her presence was subtle at first, barely noticeable and easy to disregard. Maybe I would catch something swaying ominously in the distance that I couldn't fully make out. Perhaps there would be a long shadow stretching across the hallway at night, yet no one there to cast it. After the desecration of the ritual site, however, any semblance of subtlety was completely done away with. I saw her near everywhere that I looked, occupying some dim corner, a lanky figure with bluish-gray complexion, draped in a traditional white dress that was several sizes too small, as though it belonged to a child. Her hair was oily and sparse, barely clinging to her scalp and leaving little of her face to the imagination. God, that face. Apart from its unhealthy hue, there was technically nothing wrong with it. But the way that she would just stand there and look at me with this vacant smile and wide, glassy eyes was just... I honestly can't think of an adjective that accurately describes how repulsive it felt. Dad still didn't see her. I think my mom did, but she just plain out refused to acknowledge it, even if the disheveled woman was standing literally right there, looming over her. One time I cornered her about it and, probably realizing that I was teetering on the brink of mental collapse, she told me, "Your grandmother used to say that there are things out there that like to watch, but hate to be seen. Once you do, it's best to pretend like you don't." And so that's what I did. I spent over 2 months pretending like the grinning entity watching us from across the room wasn't there. Like its emaciated frame wasn't the first thing that I would see whenever I stepped through that door. I wouldn't go as far to say that I got used to it. Trying to go to sleep with that thing's silhouette propped against the opposite wall never got easy. And keep in mind that I was dealing with this in parallel with everything else going on in town. The reason why I'm telling you this, even though I probably shouldn't, is that the tall woman suddenly stopped appearing around the house just a few days prior to me stumbling across Maria's body. Last week, another murder was reported. The goat herder's wife was found in much the same state, with her battered remains tied to a tree directly outside of their home, and a cowbell dangling from her neck. I have a feeling that you won't be the last one. So let's summarize, shall we? I'm a teenage girl trapped in the middle of nowhere with a homicidal ghost that exclusively preys on women, and may or may not be connected to the curse that is progressively decimating our livelihood. I have next to no access to the outside world, and the police can't be ours to help. FML.